All right, let's talk about fungi. So, we're wrapping up our look at classification and taxonomy. Fungi is going to be one of the last things that we talk about. So, let's jump into fungus. All right, so three major questions here. Can we identify the major characteristics of fungi? Do we know the main parts of a fungus? All right, and can we identify some of the good things and some of the bad things that fungi are responsible for? Now, as far as what a fungus is, it can either be single-celled or multi-celled, right? Either way, it's going to be a eukaryote, so we know it has a nucleus. They're all heterotrophs, which means they get their energy from their food, right? There's something else. They're not autotrophs. They don't make their own food. They're decomposers, which means they feed on dead things. And this is a really important one. They all have cell walls, and that cell wall is made of chitin. All right, so that word that we see right there at the end is chitin. So it's pronounced kite in. All right, chitin. That's how we say that. Now, chitin is actually a really interesting compound. It can be converted to chitosan or chitosan, and then we use that to make all kind of stuff. We use it to make water purifiers, cosmetics, catalysts for chemical reactions. We use it in biomedical devices, and we find it in a couple specific places throughout the animal kingdom. Now you'll notice all of these are aquatic except one, right? So it's a fungus are a pretty attractive source of chitin for industry. So if you end up looking into um, biomedical research or bioengineering, you may see chitin being used sometime down the road. Now, as far as the major structure of a fungus is concerned, there are a couple of important things you need to be able to identify. First, there is the spore, and spores are cells that are dispersed out of a fruiting body of a fungus in order to grow new fungi. Think of them kind of like a seed. There are hypha or hyphae, which are these thin filaments used to absorb food and water. They are underground, and that is the main actual part of a fungus. A bunch of hyphae together, so hypha is one filament, hyphae is many. All of the hyphae together in that one fungal organism is called the mycelium. And then the thing that actually grows up out of the ground that produces the spores is called the fruiting body. Usually, this is what we call a mushroom. And when you look at a mushroom, this is actually what's kind of going on there. So, everything above the ground is the fruiting body, and everything below is the mycelium. The mycelium is made of hyphae, which is made of individual hypha. All right, so like there is one hypha right there. Okay, and it can branch and whatever, but it's obviously different from this hypha. Okay, so those are the main parts of our mushrooms, of our fungi. Now, a spore under the microscope is actually a really useful thing. Spores are unique to their fungal counterpart, so they're great for identifying what kind of fungus you're looking at. You're probably familiar with spores if you ever kicked a puffball. So here's a puffball, right? Um, Puffball, and you kick it, and the spores come out like a big dust cloud. So you've probably seen one of those before. Now, fungi have a lot of diversity, right? They're kind of similar to the protists family or the protists kingdom in that they have so much diversity. We have molds, we have mildews, there are yeasts, mushrooms, there are sac fungi, puffballs, parasites. The list goes on. Um, Most of them are readily recognizable, okay? Now, when we start looking at how they reproduce, we find that almost every single phylum underneath the kingdom, right, the next subset down, is slightly different. Uh, and so we're really not going to get into that a whole lot, okay? But we are going to talk about the kind of the common life cycle of the fungus and the use of spores. Just so you can have an idea of what we're talking about when we look at these, I have a couple pictures for you. So this is a mildew. Here are a bunch of the different edible mushrooms that you may encounter in the kitchen. Let's see, I want to make sure that's true. Truffles, right? Pigs hunt truffles. very expensive. The morel mushroom is one that we have here. I happen to find them very delicious. They're quite good. Shiitake mushrooms you've probably heard of. Button mushrooms are great in omelets, so are portobello mushrooms. You know, the list goes on, right? So useful things. Now, the common life cycle of a fungus is pretty simple. So we're going to start with the spore germination as step one. So a spore lands on suitable ground. There's something it can, grow from, and it germinates. So just like a plant germinates, the spore is going to germinate. And as it grows, it's going to produce those hyphae. As the hyphae grow and overlap each other, that forms a mat, and we call that the mycelium. And that mycelium grows and grows and grows and matures, and eventually it starts to form a fruiting body. The fruiting body gets bigger and bigger and eventually opens up into a full-blown mushroom. And then out of that fruiting body, more spores are going to be produced, and they're going to, blow away on the wind or get carried away in the water, and they're going to germinate somewhere else. And when you look at this mushroom, please notice that these things are called gills, but they're not breathing. They're not that kind of gills. They're kind of like little pockets where the spores like kind of fall down through there. So that's what the basic life cycle of a fungus consists of. So spores germinate, they grow into a big mat. The mat produces a fruiting body. The fruiting body grows and eventually drops more spores. Now, how can the fungi benefit us? Well, they help clean the environment, right? They get rid of dead things. They break them down. We use them to make food, right? We use them to make pretty much all the adult beverages, right? Anything with alcohol in it that involves yeast. Yeast is a fungus, so it does kind of help us with fermentation. But it can also cause infections. It can spoil our food. And one of the really extreme examples is actually from the insect kingdom and how the insects interact with the fungus. So there's a video here at the end from the BBC, and it's on cordyceps, all right? And cordyceps is a really interesting fungus. So uh, you can watch this on your own, but I'll give you a basic synopsis. Basically, there is a cordyceps species that can infect an insect species. So, like, there's one cordyceps fungus that infects ants. That's what this video is about. There's one that does snails. There's one that does butterflies, or whatever in the jungle. The spore lands on the ant's head and actually like takes over its brain and starts to make it do things. It makes it climb up really high onto a branch, and it makes it bite onto it and hold onto it, and then out of its head, this fruiting body is going to grow. And when the fruiting body, if I get my words out, let's see, let's skip ahead, starts to grow. It's like crazy looking, right? So obviously this ant has now died, but the fruiting body is going to grow, and it's going to, on its tip, produce more spores. Those spores are then going to, fall to the ground and kind of hopes to encounter another ant. This is a really impressive form of population control. And as it rains down these spores on the ants, it keeps the ants from kind of taking over. Now, there are a lot of different versions of cordyceps. You see they put out all these different fruiting bodies. And that's kind of my synopsis of it. Now, you can go watch this with David Attenborough narrating it, doing a much better job than I do. But it is certainly a very interesting fungus. Okay. Now, hopefully, you know the major characteristics of the fungi. You know the main parts of a fungus, right? You can identify spore, hyphae, mycelium, fruiting body, those kind of things. And I want you to be able to list a couple good things and a couple bad things fungi do. In my opinion, definitely one of the more interesting things fungi do is keep insect populations in check with the cordyceps fungus. All right, that's definitely an interesting one. If you have any questions, let me know. I'd be glad to give you guys a hand.